Hey everybody. I don't know how much of this book I'm actually going to read, but I just wanted to read the introduction for funsies. It might be relevant. I might end up reading the whole thing and get really involved in the book, but just wanted to check it out. Um, but this is the introduction from Trotskyism and Maoism, Theory and Practice in France and the United States. Um, the chapters of this book are Theories and Contexts, Trotskyism in France, Maoism in France, Trotskyism in the United States, Maoism in the United States, a dialectical view of Trotskyism and Maoism, epilogue, developments in the 1980s. And the book is dedicated to a Jane Ellen Moorhas. I'm going to read the acknowledgments. Any work which attempts to open up scholarly inquiry into active social movements which have largely been ignored by scholars is heavily dependent upon the cooperation of precisely the people whom it studies. The work is of that nature, and it is no exception to the rule. I regret to say that I am not sure how much reciprocity is involved, since the most profound insights of academics are usually nothing that the activists themselves have not considered. At the very least, I hope that I have portrayed accurately and fairly the positions and actions of the groups which I have dealt with. Since there is also some criticism inherent in analysis, some people who cooperate with me might read some of the things which they disagree with, which they might read some things with which they disagree or which they find offensive. I can only assure them, as well as the reading public, that such critical analysis is both honest and fallible, that while I do not belong to any of the groups studied, I respect the commitment to human emancipation and the dedicated work, often undertaken at considerable personal cost, of those who do, and am sincerely grateful for the kindness and assistance that was so generously extended by a number of individuals affiliated with these groups. Because there can be political costs attached to talking with writers, some who cooperated with me asked that I not acknowledge their cooperation at all. Others have asked that I acknowledge either only the cooperation of the organization or their personal cooperation without involving the organization. Respecting these requests, I should like to thank the following organizations or the staffs of the following publications in France for their cooperation: La Cause du Peuple, le Centre d'études et de recherche sur les mouvements trotskistes et révolutionnaires internationaux, les comités communistes pour l'autogestion, libération, la Ligue communiste révolutionnaire, lutte ouvrière, les partis communistes marxistes-léninistes de France, and l'Union des communistes de France marxiste-léniniste. Elaine Geismar. I'll look some of these people up. I'll get more out of it if I do that. Elaine Geismar. Wikipedia says Elaine Geismar was born in 1939 in Paris. It's probably Alain, actually, is how you say it. Alain Geismar is a French politician and honorary inspector general of education. Alain Geismar was one of the student leaders during the unrest of May 1968 in France. Alain Geismar was born in the 16th arrondissement of Paris to an Alsatian Jewish family. He attended the Lycée Janson de Sailly High School and later became the fourth leader of the Union of Communist Students alongside André Sénic. Geismar is married to Sylvie V. Fiorca, deputy mayor of the Parti Socialiste, the second arrondissement of Paris. Geismar was previously married to Radith Esten, with whom he had two sons, Francois in 1965 and Pierre who lived from 1973 to 2006. While attending the National School of Mines in Nancy, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Geismar began his political career campaigning for the Étudiants Socialistes Unifiés, the United Socialist Students. He became the organization's national leader under the direction of Jean Paperin, his former history teacher Janson Desailly. In 1965, Geismar became Deputy Secretary General of the National Union of Higher Education, SNES-UP, opposing the orthodoxy of the French Communist Party and the so-called, quote, leftist tendency. By the end of 1966, he left the Unified Socialist Party, Parti Socialiste Unifié, to become the elected secretary of the SNES-UP on the basis of a motion, quote, for a small cultural revolution at the university, end quote, late in 1967. On the 2nd of May 1968, Geismar became one of the leaders of May 1968 with Jacques Sauvegot, Vice President of the National Union of Students of France, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, might be Cohn-Bendit, he's German, I think, actually, Mouvement du 22nd Mars, and who joined the movement of 22nd of March on the 8th of May. By the end of 1968, he was leading a Maoist organization with his partner, Benny Levy, the Gauche Proletarienne. On the 22nd of October 1970, he was sentenced to 8 months in a Fresnes prison for his acts on reconstituting the dissolved movement. Once out of jail, Geismar continued working in politics. And on the 18th of June 1976, Geismar signed the Appel du 18 joint manifesto supporting the, quote, total decriminalization of cannabis. In 1984, Geismar was appointed as Deputy Director General of IT Agency ADI by its president, Charlie Gourig, and became the director of ADI's Education Division. Geismar helped install computers in prisons to prepare prisoners for civilian life. In 1987, ADI's Education Division was abolished and returned to its original administrative functions. In 1986, Alain Geismar joined the French Socialist Party, and Alain Geismar was appointed Inspector General of National Education on the 16th of October, 1990. In May 1991, Alain Geismar entered the cabinet of Lionel Jospin under Deputy Director André Legnel's cabinet in the Michel Rocard government. Then, Alain Geismar became Minister of State, Minister of National Education, Edith Cresson government. In 1992, Alain Geismar joined the office of Jean Glavany, the Secretary of State for Technical Education. From 2001 to his retirement in July 2004, he was in charge of education and educational research at various universities in France, as well as an advisor for the mayor of Paris, Bertrand Delanoë. Sorry, back to the text. Alain Krivine lived from 1941 to 2022 and was a French Trotskyist leader. Krivine was born in July 1941 in Paris, France, the child of Pierre-Léon Georges Krivine, a stomatologist, and Esther Lautman, the sister of French resistance fighter Albert Lautman. The Krivine family originally came from Ukraine, having fled to France during the anti-Semitic pogroms of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Krivine was one of the leaders of the May 1968 revolt in Paris and was the last of the generation radicalized in the 1960s to serve the political bureau of the LCR. Alain Krivine was the candidate of the LC at the French presidential election of 1969, getting 0.05% of the votes. He released his first book that same year, The Electoral Farce. In 1974, Alain Krivine participated in the founding of the Front Communiste Révolutionnaire, which became the LCR, the Revolutionary Communist League, in that same year. Alain Krivine was the FCR's presidential candidate in 1974, coming in ninth place with around 0.37% of votes. He released his second book in 1974 entitled Questions on the Revolution. He was a member of the Revolutionary Communist League, which is the French section of the reunified Fourth International. Alain Krivine was a member of the Revolutionary Communist League, the Revolutionary Communist League's political bureau until March 2006, when Alain Krivine resigned from that committee. Alain Krivine was a member of the European Parliament from 1999 to 2004. Krivine died on the 12th of March 2022 in Paris at the age of 80. His funeral was held in the Père Lachaise cemetery on the 21st of March 2022. Over 2,000 people attended it, including many left-wing and far-left figures such as Jean-Luc Mélenchon, former presidential candidate of La France Insoumise, deputies Adrien Quatennens, Alexis Corbière, former Revolutionary Communist League presidential candidate Olivier Besancenot, former NPA presidential candidate Philippe Poutou, journalist Edwy Plenel, and the former militant and syndicalist Gérard Filoche. Back to the text. François de Maoist. Wikipedia says François de Maoist is a political activist, writer, and journalist. He is the son of the surrealist writer Pierre de Maoist, an associate of Francis Picabia and André Breton. Maoist is of French-Scottish extraction and fluent in English. He has worked as a translator, including in the film industry. Maoist joined the Trotskyist movement in France as a young man just after the end of the Second World War. Like other young Trotskyists, he was a work volunteer in Tito's Yugoslavia. Maoist supported the Marcel Pleibtreu Pierre Lambert wing of the Parti Communiste Internationaliste after they split with Pierre Franck and Michel Pablo in 1953 and remained a close associate of Pierre Lambert. De Maoist gave an oration at Lambert's funeral. For most of François de Maoist's life, he had been a political activist with the PCI-OCI, Organisation Communiste Internationaliste, and its successors. François de Maoist was, from an early time, responsible for the link between the Lambert Group in France and the Healy Group in Britain, later become the Socialist Labor League, as well as the American Socialist Workers' Party, the main components of the internal committee of the Fourth International from 1953 to 1963. In this capacity, he regularly attended conferences of the Socialist Labor League and meetings of the ICFI. He is the author of a book on the May-June events in France, was a journalist at Information Ouvrière and the OCI-PCI newspaper, has been an editor of La Vérité, the OCI theoretical journal, and was in charge of the international work of the Organizing Committee for the Reconstruction of the Fourth International and its successors. He has been chairman of the CERMTRI archive of Trotskyism in Paris. I'm not going to look up Michel Baptiste because I've already looked him up in other videos. In fact, I have a bio of Michel Baptiste on the channel. I should also like to acknowledge the very kind reception and extension of privileges by the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques in Paris and its Secretary General, Professor Serge Hertig, as well as by the Centre Universitaire International. Professor Michel Guibault at the University d'Amiens was also very helpful. Special thanks for assistance and kindness go out to HK. Okay, continuing on. I also wish to acknowledge the kind assistance of members of the following organizations in the United States: the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party and its youth affiliate, the Young Socialist Party, SPARC, the Spartacist League, and Workers' World Party. A number of people were kind enough to read and comment on the entire manuscript or on parts of it at various stages of development. For assuming this chore, my gratitude goes out to Peter Bach, Berenice Carroll, Walter Feinberg, Richard Krauss. I mean, I'm not going to look up all these people because I'd be here till doomsday. Joseph La Palombara, Mihailo Markovich. I have a piece by him on this channel. Richard Merritt, Kelly Mickey, Joseph Miller, and Wolf Dieter Nahr. Carl Davidson was extremely helpful with the material on U.S. Maoism. Francis Robbins, Judy Gallistel, Judy Holt, Mary Marshall, Eileen Yoder all did conscientious typing, while the late Marcia Smith did equally conscientious proofreading. I am grateful to all of these people. I am also grateful for the institutional support received from the Department of Political Science, the School of Social Sciences, the Office of Western European Studies, and the Research Board of the Graduate School at the University of Illinois in Urbana. I am grateful to Sue Ann Harkey and Christopher Mays of Autonomedia for cover design and index, respectively, and to Mary Allison Farley of the Tenement Collection at New York University for assistance with archival images. To three people, I wish to express very special appreciation. Without the assistance of Professor Antioul of the University of Paris 7, assistance which went well beyond what could reasonably be expected out of either friendship or academic curiosity. I could not have kept abreast of the situation in France when I was not immediately on the scene. Her assistance was essential to the project. I am particularly grateful to Jim Fleming of Autonomedia for the commitment and work he has devoted to this book. Finally, I am grateful to Jane Moorhas. I am grateful for her skilled editorial assistance. I'm even more grateful for her friendship, companionship, and moral support during this entire project. Despite the good fortune of having all this assistance, I must assume the sole responsibility for any errors which might appear in the text. I must also assume responsibility for the translations from the French unless otherwise noted. Okay, so that's the acknowledgement from A. Beldon Fields. The preface for the acknowledgements from A. Beldon Fields. I think I'm going to keep saying this guy's name wrong until I don't. A. Beldon Fields, okay. So, introduction. This is a study of political practice and its relationship to both theory and national contextual factors with which those who attempt to implement theory must contend. All political movements claim some relationship to political theories, or at the very least to some maxims derived from theories. The tightness of the relationship between practice and theory by groups active in the political arena manifests itself in a continuum, which runs from those groups which view virtually every decision or action as having crucial theoretical implications to those which merely use theory as a legitimizing cover for the pursuit of narrowly conceived self-interest. In the latter case, theory loses all coherence and one is left with moral rationalization. In focusing on Trotskyist and Maoist groups in this study, we are operating at the tight end of the continuum. At least in their mature years, both Trotsky and Mao subscribed to Marxism-Leninism. Marxism, as understood and elaborated here upon by Lenin, conceives of theory and practice as one combined, quote, science. Here the role of theory is neither merely diagnostic nor simply suggestive nor primarily descriptive. There is a, quote, scientific weapon based on a correct analysis of history and social relations, which gives superior advantage in practice to those who wield it. Conversely, the effect of ignoring theory or of making errors in theory is to doom political practice just as surely as mistakes in deciphering the laws of physics would doom engineering attempts. Marxist-Leninists, in contradistinction to a number of other interpreters and followers of Marxism, accept Engels' modeling of Marxist social theory after theories in the physical and biological sciences. Some, like Mao, have also accepted Engels' extension of the Marxist dialectical method to an understanding of the physical universe, the, quote, dialectics of nature, end quote. When we take a cursory overview of the intended and actual practice, or praxis, since the activity in it is intended as a response to Marx's call to transform the social universe in an emancipatory direction, of Marxist-Leninists who operate as opposition currents within capitalist industrialized societies, we can distinguish three levels. First, there is practice in the form of overthrowing capitalism and instituting socialism. This, of course, has traditionally been the ultimate emancipatory goal of Marxism-Leninism, but has not been accomplished within any capitalist industrialized context. All indigenous revolutionary efforts which have resulted in the acquisition of state power by Marxist-Leninists have occurred within contexts of relatively low industrial development and internal surplus, and a low ratio of the proletariat to other more traditional segments of the population. A second level of practice is the gaining of a mass base of support. The complex structures of industrialized societies are not as congenial to the seizing of power by small vanguard groups as was pre-1917 Russia. Within these contexts, the gaining of mass support is a necessary precondition of goal number one, the institution of socialism. While that latter goal has not been accomplished by Marxist-Leninists in any capitalist industrialized society, both the French and Italian Communist parties have indeed been able to attract large memberships and significant electoral support. However, in order to maintain their mass support, both the French and Italian parties have had to modify considerably their approach to goal number one. Enter the phenomenon of Eurocommunism, the repudiation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the emphasis upon pragmatics at the expense of the science of Marxism-Leninism generally. A third level of practice is one of surviving over time with sufficient members and resources to both offer a corrective model to Marxism gone astray and to attempt intermittent influence on the larger political universe. Although certainly not by choice, this is the level at which Trotskyist and Maoist formations have been operating. This study examines just how they have gone about attempting to offer an uncorrupted scientific conception of politics within the context of those industrialized societies that Marx and Engels saw as the most fertile terrains for revolutionary change. The specific national contexts in question are France and the United States. The comparative dimension is extremely important in this endeavor. First, it permits an examination of the impact of different national political characteristics upon movements which subscribe to the same highly specific body of theory. It is interesting to see to what extent such movements, quote, look alike, or, quote, look different, as one moves across national boundaries and political cultures. But, secondly, comparative investigation can also warn against exclusive reliance upon contextual factors. For example, in a discussion of what she regards as the failure of American Trotskyism, Constance Ashton Myers has written that, quote, and, quote, all-inclusive, end quote, radical party, the kind envisioned by Norman Thomas for the American Socialist Party, was clearly better adapted to American attitudes and traditions, end quote. Leaving aside the fact that from 1941 to the present, the American Socialist Party has suffered a fate more dismal than that of the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party, the limited appeal and fragmentation of Trotskyist and Maoist, not only in the United States but also France, where there exists a strong Marxist tradition and a large and relatively cohesive Communist Party, directs one back to the guiding theories themselves for a full explanation of the characteristics of these movements. The major proposition of this work is thus that limited appeal, debilitating fragmentation, and the precise lines of cleavage which divide both Trotskyist and Maoist movements in France and the United States are attributable to a convergence of one, the particularities of the political culture in which the attempt to apply the theories is made, with two, contradictions which inhere in the guiding theories themselves. Methodologically, this means that the analysis must incorporate both empirical positivistic explanations based upon external causal factors and a consideration of the internal dialectics of Trotskyism and Maoism as theoretical structures. Aside from what is revealed about relationships between political practice, contextual factors, and theory, and what it tells us about the problems faced by Marxist-Leninists who attempt a rigorous implementation of their science in capitalist societies, there are additional reasons why a study of this nature is important. First, as we shall see, these movements played important roles in one of the most significant political phenomena of the 1960s and 1970s in France and the United States. This was the radicalization of young people. While much of the activity which went on during the late 60s and the early and mid-70s was spontaneous, Trotskyist and Maoist groups contributed disciplined work of theoretical, organizational, and propagandistic nature. This work was important in sustaining level of interest between events and in providing channels for political engagement with greater permanence and direction than demonstrations or street barricades could afford. Trotskyists and Maoists, on their own or in cooperation with others, created wide ranges of sympathizing structures and ad hoc support groups devoted to specific struggles. They were thus able to have an impact upon a wider range of the population than their own immediate memberships. Yet this experience goes unrecorded. Secondly, while both in France and the United States the membership of Trotskyist and Maoist groups has remained well below that of Marxist-Leninist parties with greater sympathy for the Soviet Union, it must be kept in mind that Maoist movements independent of the larger communist parties are a new historical phenomenon, which date from the Sino-Soviet split, while Trotskyist movements in France and the United States, as well as on a worldwide level, reached their historical membership peaks in the 1970s. The latter was a rather remarkable achievement on part of Trotskyists. They have survived for over half a century after Trotsky's exile from the USSR without the existence of any regime which could serve as a functioning model or source of support. Yet if this unique variant of Marxism-Leninism does not show any immediate sign of the capability of stimulating or executing a revolution in any capitalist country in the world, neither does it show any signs of disappearing from the scene. Moreover, the internal discipline and ability to find ways of influencing people outside of their own ranks exhibited by these newly created and juvenated groups has permitted them to accomplish certain goals, with the near exception of the 1968 French Revolt in which some Trotskyists and Maoists participated. These accomplishments have fallen short of overthrowing regimes, but they are of intrinsic importance and have affected people's lives regardless of whether or not they should prove in the future to have been part of a larger historical revolutionary process. Despite these considerations, there has been almost no scholarly literature devoted to the dynamics of these groups or the specific content of Trotskyist and Maoist politics. This writer can point to only one article, Jim O'Brien's American Leninism in the 1970s, which deals with Trotskyist and Maoist movements in the United States. Of the two books produced by American scholars in recent years which deal with Trotskyist movements, One deals with them in the Latin American context, while the other deals with the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States, but only up to the year 1941. I'm assuming that's Constance Ashton Myers and Robert J. Alexander. There's somewhat more literature in France, but most of it is polemical and little has been translated for the benefit of the English language readership. The absence of published research on this subject matter is an impediment to scholarly understanding. For a concrete example of that, one can consult the review article written by Mario di Fegno for the special spring and summer 1977 issue of Studies in Comparative Communism. In this special issue devoted to Trotskyism by a major scholarly journal, there is almost no information on contemporary movements. Fegno, who was charged with the task of reporting on such research, tried, but Fegno came to the conclusion that in the United States there exists a, quote, conspiracy of silence directed against Trotskyism even by other groups on the left. Fegno's discussion of Trotskyism in Western Europe is very brief because he could not find, quote, any description of the evolution of Trotskyism into the countries of Western Europe, systematic or unsystematic, end quote. This author's experience with both American and East European colleagues, even those who work with socialist systems, has revealed that they know very little about Trotskyism and Maoism as active opposition forces. Sorry, I'm trying to find these notes here. I'll look at the notes at the end of when I'm done reading the introduction. I'll start reading them now, but the ones that I missed, I'm not going to go back to now. But aside from being an impediment to scholarly understanding, the lack of available material of a scholarly or precise nature has been an advantage to governments intent upon repressing these movements. In the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia, where accused Trotskyists were put on trial in the early 1970s, the single parties control everything written or said in the media about Trotskyism or Maoism. Footnote. While the author was in Moscow as a participant in the Congress of the International Political Science Association, he was asked for an interview by a correspondent for Radio Moscow. The correspondent was particularly interested in the phenomenon of Maoism. After the responses to some very direct questions about Maoists were not suitably derogatory, he very politely thanked the author, told him that he personally had learned a great deal from it, but said he doubted very much if his superiors would put it on the air. He said he doubted very much that his superiors would put it on the air. End footnote. Either designation is equivalent to, quote, counter-revolutionary. If there are Trotskyists or Maoists in these countries, they can ill afford to make the fact public. In China, Trotskyism is also used as a political charge synonymous with counter-revolutionary. Footnote. For a scholarly treatment of Chinese Trotskyism, see Joseph T. Miller's The Politics of Chinese Trotskyism, The Role of Permanent Opposition in Chinese Communism. PhD dissertation, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. End footnote. Indeed, it is one of the charges levied against the, quote, Gang of Four. But repression against Trotskyists and Maoists is not restricted to Marxist regimes. Both French and American governments have also used repressive techniques against Trotskyists and Maoists. However, because of the greater public awareness of their existence in France, as well as the greater sympathy for Marxist groups in general, governmental repression usually encounters a public outcry of protest and support for the repressed from other groups and prominent individuals. In the United States, which has developed into a science techniques for obliterating the memory of its own radicals from its school curricula and media, the major problem is certainly not the, quote, conspiracy of silence, end quote, perpetrated by other groups on the left referred to by Fenyo. It is rather the absence of accurate information accessible to the public that has facilitated governmental repression against both Trotskyists and Maoists. The Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party was the first group to have its leadership tried and convicted under the Smith Act, and it was, in the 1960s and 1970s, a major target of completely illegal COINTELPRO disruption program conducted by the FBI. Aside from the violent aspects of that program itself, much of the effort was devoted to the creation of an image of the Socialist Workers' Party as a violent group through the FBI's journalistic contacts and through anonymous letter-writing techniques. The lack of any scholarly or objective media treatment of the Socialist Workers' Party meant that there was no possibility of a reality check against the FBI's definition of the party. Once the government is able to define a group for the few among the general public who are even aware of its existence, the government has a very free hand. More recently, the American government has turned its attention to the Maoist Revolutionary Communist Party. As a result of a January 1979 demonstration against the visit of Premier Deng Xiaoping to the United States, the top leaders of the Maoist and anti-present Chinese Leadership Party were indicted on multiple felony charges. But few people know about either that party or the specific situation, and that there was hardly a public outcry with the government, which the government had to contend. The absence of knowledge about these groups is yet another consequence which is also more aggravated in the United States than in France. It encourages chance or uninformed political engagement. Most Americans who initially affiliate with groups outside of the political mainstream do so because of chance encounters with individuals already in groups. At least at the time of initial engagement, the recruit often has little knowledge of the range of possibilities available. For those who might be inclined towards engagement in Trotskyist or Maoist group, this book will provide an overview of the nature of Trotskyism and Maoism, and a detailed discussion of the variety of interpretations and kinds of practice which are in existence. If knowledge is better than ignorance for the scholar, it is certainly no less important for the activist or potential activist. The precise research techniques employed in this study were the collection and examination of documents and textual material, interviews, and participant observation. The research was begun during a sabbatical semester in France in 1972. Additional research trips to France were made in 1975 and again in 1978 after the legislative elections of that year, which had such a remarkable impact upon the left as a whole. An attempt has been made to incorporate all of the national and even some of the regional Trotskyist and Maoist groups operating in both France and the United States. Particularly in the case of Maoism, some tiny and/or purely local groups have been omitted. That was due to the lack of availability of data and access rather than a deliberate attempt to slight any particular groups. While the study focuses on contemporary movements, the importance of the accumulation of past experience for a present identity is recognized. Thus, each of the chapters on the movements begin with an historical treatment going back to their origins. The work is organized as follows. Chapter 1 first offers a brief and non-critical comparison of Trotsky's basic concepts with those of Mao. In particular, it focuses on two of Trotsky's most important contributions to revolutionary theory: permanent revolution and the transitional program, and compares them with Mao's concept of uninterrupted revolution. Even to many scholars who work in related areas, the distinction between the basic concepts of Trotsky and those of Mao are not clear. Without getting into the more complex problem of theoretical contradiction at this stage, this portion of the chapter is intended to provide such clarification and to provide the reader with some basis for understanding the theoretical inspiration of the movements which are discussed in the main body of the work. The second part of this chapter discusses the similarities and differences between the context in which French and American Trotskyists and Maoists attempt to apply their theories in practice. The body of the work is composed of 4 chapters, dealing with the Trotskyist and Maoist movements in each of the countries through the decade of the 1970s. These chapters discuss the history, patterns of organization, programs, and the strategies and tactics pursued by the variety of groups operating under those banners. Because of the number of groups involved, the frequent splintering and name changes, and the probable lack of prior exposure to this material on the part of most readers, chronological charts of the groups discussed are included at the end of the book, along with the notes and bibliography. The reader might wish to consult these charts to gain an overview before reading each of these chapters. The 6th chapter attempts a synthetic demonstration of the proposition that the dynamics of Trotskyist and Maoist practice and the configuration which these movements assume within any given national context is determined by the interplay between peculiarities within the specific political culture and contradictions within the guiding theories themselves. The analysis is based upon the data contained in the previous 4 chapters and a more critical analytical consideration of the theories than is presented in Chapter 1. The chapter terminates with what, in this author's view, is the major problem facing Marxist-Leninists who attempt to apply uncorrupted scientific interpretations of Marxism-Leninism to contemporary industrial capitalist societies. As indicated above, during the 1980s, there have been some new directions taken by Trotskyists and Maoists in the 2 countries. An epilogue has been separately provided to take into account those more recent developments for most of the 1980s to best accommodate readers whose primary interests are more contemporary. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction to Trotskyism and Maoism, Theory and Practice in France and the United States by A. Let's look up his name again, because I'm an idiot. A. Beldon Fields. Thank you for listening.